Context tells you a lot, doesn't it? And I like to put this particular passage I just read about the Transfiguration in context, because it's a vision. Like Matthew calls it a vision. The story is also in Mark and Luke, but it's not called a vision. As Matthew tells the story, a little while before in his gospel, there's a scene where Jesus said to his disciples, "Who do people say I am?" I guess there were no Gallup polls in those days, and Jesus couldn't get a sense of the people, so he did his own little apostle poll. Who do people say I am? And so this Transfiguration story is throwing light on who Jesus is. And that's the big question for us, for the world, for every Christian. Who is Jesus? And the apostles struggled with it. Let's first go back to this whole story. It happened on a mountain. The mountain is not named. Many people think it's Mount Horeb up in the north of Israel, the highest mountain with snow on the top. Some people it's Mount Sinai, down the Sinai Peninsula. If you go as a tourist to Israel, they'll bring you to Mount Tabor in the Jezreel Valley up near Galilee. Mount Tabor, and it's kind of a funny-looking mountain like a loaf of bread sticking out of a plane. And they taxi you up because the buses can't make the winding road. And there's a church up there, built by the Franciscans, of course, and maintained by the Franciscans, and that's where your Good Friday collection goes every year, to maintain those holy sites in the Holy Land. But back to the mountain. Doesn't matter what mountain. But they're on the mountain, and typically all the big events in the Bible happen on a mountaintop. But this mountaintop has this vision that Peter, James, and James's brother John get to see. And in the vision, you must remember, as Matthew describes the vision, Matthew is a Jew writing to Jews. And he's trying to convert them to Jesus. A Jew writing to Jews. So he has this on a mountaintop. Jesus' face becomes dazzling white, so do his clothes. And who's beside him? Moses and Elijah. And the other story, all his audience would have known, all his listeners, his Jewish listeners. Moses was one time on a mountaintop for 40 days of Lent, after wandering 40 years in the desert, great biblical number 40. And Moses, when he came down from the mountain with the 10 Commandments, his face was dazzling white. So now, be a Jew, knowing about Moses, hearing Matthew tell you a story about Jesus with the dazzling white face and clothes. Not only with Moses, with Elijah. Elijah, arguably the greatest of the prophets. You remember he had a big fight with Queen Jezebel and he had to run for his life, and he ran for 40 days and 40 nights. Here's that number again. And where did he end up? On Mount Sinai. Same place that Moses got the commandments. So Matthew is selling Jesus. That's a bit crude, but he's selling Jesus to his Jewish congregation. The mountaintop, Moses and Elijah chatting together. And then a bright cloud comes, and out of the cloud comes a voice. And this is what the Jewish people would call the Shekinah, the divine presence. And out of the cloud comes a voice that says, "This is my beloved Son." Who is Jesus? "This is my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased. Listen to him." Does that remind you Christians of any other story? When John the Baptist baptized Jesus, a voice, "This is my beloved Son," raising the question, who is Jesus? And Peter, James, and John were so enthralled with the vision that they wanted to stay there. "We'll build 3 tents for the 3 of you so you'll be comfortable, Jesus, Moses, and Elijah. This is great. We're having a great time. We're up on the mountain with you." And Jesus said, "No, we have to go down the mountain." And suddenly, the vision was over. And the disciples fell down in fear. And Jesus came over and touched them and took away their fear. And we who have experienced fear, especially the fear of dying, it's in our prayer when Jesus touches us that we are healed. Back to the vision. When I was a very young priest, I remember doing a funeral for a man, and his wife was heartbroken. They could have been married 60 years for all I remember. Don't remember those details. What I do remember is that she would come to church weeks later crying, still wanting a hug, still heartbroken after the loss of her husband. And one Sunday she came and she wasn't crying. And I said, "You look happier today." And she said, "I saw something last night. When I was lying in bed, I looked up in the corner of the room, and my husband was there, and he smiled at me." That vision changed her. And since then, I've heard many of those stories. I don't have a vision story myself, but visions change people. And whether we call it a vision like Matthew does, Mark and Luke tells the same story but doesn't call it a vision, it's still something that changes us, that touches us. But the disciples wanted to stay in the mountain because they liked the idea of who Jesus was. The miracle worker, the preacher that got great crowds, the guy who was very popular with the sick, the guy who's transfigured on a mountain. They didn't want anything to change. But back to context. Matthew told this story in his gospel. And in his gospel, he has 3 times that Jesus said, "I'm going to Jerusalem. I'm going to be whipped and crucified and die. And I'll rise again." And the guy said, "No way. No way. You're our miracle worker, transfigured on a mountain. We love it this way. Cut out this suffering, whipping, and dying stuff." And Matthew puts the story of the transfiguration in between the first and the second prediction of Jesus, predicting his suffering and death. So Jesus then, when the whole vision is over, what did he say to them? Don't tell anyone. Not because it's to be a secret, but it's only part of the story. When I rise from the dead, you can tell everyone, because this is foreshadowing a rising from the dead. So, the 3 apostles, Peter, James, and John, are trying to keep an image of Jesus. They're trying to keep who Jesus is, their answer to that question, and not get the whole picture. You're probably familiar with one of the most successful preachers in America, Joel Osteen. And he preaches to tens of thousands every Sunday. And he's probably one of the richest, I don't know. I don't know much else about him, but what I do know about him is that he was interviewed once and someone said to him, "You never preach about sin." And he said, "No, I want to always only have a positive message." And he's successful that way. But his picture of Jesus is too small. Sin comes into the picture. Our sin, his redeeming death. And I think one of the things is we have to look at, how big is our Jesus? We have many Catholic politicians in our country. Sometimes I wonder. One of them, in the last few months, 6 months ago maybe, one of them, a high prominent Catholic politician, said, and he's a convert to Catholicism, he said, "The gospel calls us, first of all, to love ourselves. Secondly, to love our neighbor. And secondly, to love our family. And thirdly, to love our neighbor." That's not the gospel. In fact, the gospel is the total opposite to that. Total opposite. Jesus never talks about loving yourself, except in the context one time he said, "Love your neighbor as yourself." But he never said, "Love yourself." And for someone to say, it's love yourself, love your family, love everyone else, that's wrong. Back in the 70s, when I went to Israel for the very first time, I wanted to see this conservative area, Mea Shearim. And I heard that if a woman walks in there with bare arms, they'll throw stones at her. And I didn't see any of that. But as I walked in there, I saw a graffiti on the wall, graffiti for want of a better word, and it said, it said Zionism and Judaism are diametrically opposed. And I asked another priest with me, well, what exactly does that mean? Zionism and Judaism diametrically opposed, I got. They're totally incompatible. And the other priest said to me, well, Zionism is politics. It's nothing to do with religion. Judaism, by that definition, is everything to do with religion. And we have some of those things happening in our country, like the word nationalist is thrown out. Christian nationalist is thrown out. I am a citizen in this country, though not born here. I am a patriot. I love this country. I would do what I can to make it a better country. But a nationalist sees this country as superior to every other country and acts in that way. Patriotism and nationalism are diametrically opposed. Nationalism and Christianity are diametrically opposed. I was watching the news the other day, and many of the newscasters, the women more than the men, Mr. Pillow wears a cross, but one of the newscasters was wearing a little gold cross, and she and her colleague were calling somebody a total idiot and the word imbecile. And I'm looking at the little cross and listening to the words and the judgment and asking, is this your Jesus? Is this what the man who reached out to lepers and the sick and the estranged and the adulterer and the thief? Is this the man who approves calling someone an imbecile? The question I raised at the beginning, the apostles struggled with who Jesus is, and they wanted him nicely packaged the way they package him. And we have the same struggle, the same issue. And today, this gospel of transfiguration can speak to us too. Jesus is not Jesus by our definition. We don't get to put him in a little package. And Jesus calls us, number one, to love our neighbor. Well, actually, number two, love God and love your neighbor. When he was asked the greatest commandment, love God. Second, love your neighbor. If we take that seriously, we transform Chatsworth. Chesterton was right. He said Christianity hasn't failed, it hasn't been tried. I think in Lent, it should challenge us. When the voice came from the cloud, it said, listen to him. And we struggle. Are we listening to our own needs? Or is that the voice of God? Are we listening to what we think is best for us? Or are we listening to something that calls us to love our neighbor? We have a lot to learn about God and Jesus. We're on this journey. I hope the Transfiguration story throws some light on it for all of us.